and whether an explanation concords or conflicts with our ideology can predict empathy or defensiveness. And interventions can perhaps attenuate bias by decoupling what should be true in people's minds from what is true. Okay, next paradigm, role of identity and resistance to persuasion and intergroup conflict. Here we're really interested, my colleagues and I are really interested in resistance to persuasion and intransigence in negotiation. Why do people dig in their heels and fail to change their attitudes, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes in the face of well-reasoned evidence? And why are they unwilling to compromise with adversaries across the partisan divide, even when compromise would carry a lot of pragmatic benefits? Drawing on some classic research by Bob Abelson, we thought that, well, for many political issues, long-held beliefs are sources of identity. They're lodged into our sense of self. Being in favor of capital punishment is part of my conservative identity, my identity as a law and order conservative. So beliefs are sources of identity. To put it in Abelsonian terms, beliefs are like possessions. They're treasured possessions. They express who we are. And so for that reason, they're painful to give up. So given this analysis, this sort of functional expressive analysis of beliefs as sources of identity, what can you do to overcome resistance to persuasion, intransigence, and negotiation? Well, one thing we know doesn't work is appeals to rationality. Just telling people, well, be objective, be rational, please, does not work, and may actually, in some research, be counterproductive, because when you tell people to be rational, well, being rational is by definition applying what I think and what I believe to this issue. What I think it, therefore it's true. So if I'm instructed to be rational, I should apply my beliefs even more. Appeals to rationality seem to be unproductive. Instead, a debiasing strategy that does work well, at least in some cases, is that of self-affirmation, or affirmations of alternative identities alluded to by Dan Kahan. And here the notion is that people will be more open to change if you remind them of some identity unrelated to the persuasive message or the negotiation issue that they feel threatened by. So as an example of an affirmation of an alternative identity is reflecting on a self-defining value, such as relationships with friends or religion, one's role as a father. So if I remind myself about my role as a father, I might be more laid back about giving in on the issue of capital punishment, is the idea, because the sort of identity stakes of movement on my political identity are less costly to my sense of self-worth, because I feel buttressed in this alternative domain. This research has supported this hypothesis. A lot of different research has supported this hypothesis that affirmations, self-affirmations, reflecting on a self-defined value unrelated to the negotiation or persuasion topic, reduces resistance to persuasion and lessens bias processing. People are less likely to assimilate new information in light of their pre-existing beliefs. It doesn't just make them agreeable. It's not like affirmation is just giving people rose-colored glasses. It makes them more responsive to the strength of argument. So they move only when the arguments are strong, when sort of logical necessity calls for it, not when they're weak. One of my favorite examples was by Tony Bastardi and Lee Ross, who showed that when self-affirmed, environmentalists were more open to news that global catastrophe was not imminent. So the idea is that under normal circumstances, environmentalists would rather see the world end than be wrong. And so if you self-affirm them, they're a little bit more open to the idea that, well, maybe global catastrophe won't happen. Okay, so I want to give you an example in the domain of negotiation, that used affirmation to encourage compromise across the partisan divide. This is in research with my colleagues, Tony Bastardi and David Sherman. We had a pro-choice advocate negotiate with a pro-life advocate. The pro-life advocate was actually a Confederate, on abortion legislation. So they had to come to some agreement, some middle ground agreement on appropriate legislation for abortion. Before this negotiation, they actually negotiated, there was an affirmation manipulation. In the affirmation condition, subjects wrote about an important value like relationships with friends or religion. And in the threat condition, instead, they wrote about failing to live up to this important value. Threat turns out to be kind of like a control condition here based on previous research. We also crossed this with a manipulation of identity salience. So in one condition, we made people's partisan identity salient. We asked subjects to state their true beliefs about abortion policy before the negotiation. So their behavioral commitment, their investment in the issue is made salient because they state their true beliefs. In the political identity non-salient condition, this did not happen. So we think in the political identity condition, the stakes of compromise, the motivational stakes, the ego stakes will be higher, and it should be precisely under these conditions that affirmation increases openness and willingness to compromise. So we look at the number of concessions subjects actually make in this negotiation. So do they make more concessions to their adversary after negotiating? And we find that in the political identity non-salient condition, there's no effect of affirmation. People make on average about 5 concessions to their adversary. It's kind of like a rationalistic condition. They're sort of weighting the cost and benefits. So it's not an identity relevant issue for them in this condition. And affirmation, as a consequence, has no impact. But in the political identity salient condition, there's a significant effect of affirmation such that people make on average about 8 concessions on this legislation to their adversary when affirmed compared with the controlled no threat condition. And there's an irony here, and the irony is that you would think that making your political convictions salient would actually make you more entrenched, more closed-minded. But it doesn't, at least in combination with affirmation. Making your convictions salient, stating your true convictions with affirmation actually makes people more open. And the idea is that bringing to the fore one's values, one's commitment to the issues, are actually beneficial to the negotiation process as long as you can diminish people's ego stake. We looked at also people's trust of their negotiation partner, found the same effect that people became more trusting across the partisan divide when self-affirmed in the identity salient condition. And one question that I think social psychologists, or one question that we're trying to ask ourselves all the time is, to what extent are these kinds of effects just hothouse flowers that simply wilt outside the laboratory? So we actually went out and did a field experiment. We went to a racially diverse middle school. And at this middle school, the student body was divided roughly equally between African American and white students. The teachers, by contrast, are almost all European Americans. So for African Americans, there's a racial divide at this school and the possibility of mistrust because the academic authorities are teaching them across the racial divide. At the beginning of the year, we randomly assigned students to either a control condition or an affirmation condition, which was a series of writing exercises given in class. So for instance, the affirmation condition, kids in class just get a regular exercise. They think it's a regular assignment from their teacher that looks like this. They're asked to circle their most important value, athletic ability, creativity, and then write about why it's important in the affirmation condition. In the control condition, they do various other things, such as write about their morning routine or write about an unimportant value. And then we looked at their trust of teachers and academic authorities, both at the beginning of the year in the fall and at the end of the year in the spring. For white students, there's no change. They're about a 5 on a 7-point scale, both at the beginning and the end of the year, regardless of condition. For black students in the control condition, their trust goes down. A sort of racial divide and perception opens up over the course of the year such that black students are less trusting of their teachers by the end of the year compared with the beginning of the year. But affirmation wipes out this drop such that it sustains minority students' level of trust over the course of the year. And it's almost as though the affirmation is making their racial identity less salient, so they're less likely to assimilate ongoing experience in light of that identity. Oh, and if it improves their trust, it might improve their overall grade point average. We find some evidence that on average this affirmation intervention also boosts minority students' learning as measured by their performance in school.